You're looking at the cover of an ebook titled Why Evolution is Not True. It's the same title as the website, whyevolutionisnottrue.com. And it is interesting, controversial perhaps, or you might have some other words to describe what you're looking at. But it basically shows on the left-hand side you have Darwin's book on the origin of species, and his hand is coming out of it. And on the right-hand side, you've got the hand of a minister coming out of the Holy Bible, and the two are shaking hands. There's a light bulb above them, and there's a halo above that light bulb, with the indication that there has been some alteration between these two explanations for life on Earth, some change. There's an inkling that something has changed over time. It's a battle that's been going on for over 150 years with these two alternate explanations for the existence of life on Earth. And if you look at subsequent videotapes, you'll get more complete explanation for what I'm talking about here in this picture as the change that has occurred between evolution theory and historical biblical creation. You'll see more details of that in videotapes to explain just what has happened. The next slide will show kind of the conclusions I've reached, and as I said, you will see more details about those conclusions in later videotapes. Now, what you're going to see in this book is basically that the theory of evolution has no proof. It's something that you probably have gleaned already by seeing the title of this website and the content of the first video you had looking at me talking to you. And what I'm going to basically show you that as a science area that evolution has no proof behind it. And rather ironically, that means that it is faith-based. You can either believe or not believe evolution theory, but if you do believe it, it is based upon faith. It is not based upon proof. Now, on the other hand, you will hear me say, and you've heard me say already, but you will hear me say a lot of times throughout these various tapes, that biblical creation is history. History, not science. And that history in which it is reported in the first book of Genesis in just 31 verses that God created this, and then God created that, and then God created that. So it's just a document that contains the history of biblical creation. It does not give us any information as to how this was done, the science behind it. But it has strong scientific support, and that's what you're going to see in the later tapes in this series, that there is strong scientific support that gives support to this historical account of biblical creation. So basically not science but history, and that history has support from the scientific world in various areas. And we'll see that in quite a bit of detail. It's a relative switch here in thinking, and that evolution theory is without proof, and so it's something you have to believe based upon faith. And biblical creation, which believers accept on faith also, in addition to that, it is history, and that history has scientific support. And ultimately what you're going to see in this tape and all the rest is that biblical creation is the best explanation for life on Earth. The best explanation is not evolution theory. Now, the battle to explain life has had these two possible explanations, one being creationism and the other being evolutionism. And I've shown them here as two warring soldiers, a knight perhaps fighting with a World War I doughboy. And that scientific battle has been going on since the time of Darwin's first publication, 1859, actually a few decades before that, where the thoughts were being put together by Darwin and a few others in his time. So this has been on the scientific battlefront for over 150 years, and in my opinion, I think that's been the wrong battlefront. It's a mistake to have fought that on the science battlefront, mainly because my belief that biblical creation is not science, it is history. And so what I believe is that there is a new battlefront that's pertaining now, and that is either a new battlefront or, in effect, there is no battle on a common battleground for these two descriptions for life on Earth. Again, creation history is history, and I've coined a term, biblical creationism, here, which means to me biblical history with scientific support. And as I've already indicated several times, you'll see that scientific support for the biblical creation side in a number of the tapes that follow. So as I'm concerned right now, I've shown a peace symbol here. There is a peace between these two sides, at least on the science battlefront, if not on any battlefront. And I've shown here the Special Forces evolution fighter who's taken a rest now because he really has nothing to fight with, no one to fight with on a common ground. This slide contains a lot of information. It may be one of those slides you might want to stop at some point and look at it in a little more detail. I'll go through the words of what's on this slide, and then I'll give you enough time at the end if you choose to stop it to take a closer look at it before I go on to the next slide. The slide basically contains the summary of what is contained in biblical creation history and what is contained in evolution theory. The biblical creation side we'll look at first here. It says that creation occurred during 6 days, days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That on days 1 and 2, God created the universe, and the earth was created on day 3, and all the earth living beings were created subsequent to that. On day 3, vegetation was created, and on day 4, the only living being thing that was going on was that vegetation continued to grow. And then on day 5, sea creatures, water creatures were created, along with fish, sea monsters, and birds at the end of that day. And then ultimately on day 6, God created cattle, land animals, and man. And so that's the sequence that is contained in the first book of Genesis in just 31 verses. This explanation for historically how creation transpired. Now, evolution theory picks up at the creation of the earth. It does not deal with the universe, but at day 3 in biblical creation and in evolution theory, that day the earth was created and is now 4.5 billion years old. And that about 1 billion years later, at 3.5 billion years ago, the first living being appeared. It was a single-celled living being, and that living being resulted in sequentially in all of the plants and animals being created. In effect, that living being is the parent, the original parent of all plants and animals that ever existed and that exist in the world today. And all those plants and animals evolved, changed, mutated sequentially from that single-celled animal. Now that was possible because there was a great deal of time, 3.5 billion years till today, and that evolution occurred in very many small steps. And so it was very slow, very small changes over a very long expanse of time to result in all these different plants and animals changing one into the other. Now, further belief is that evolution's path was unplanned. There was no initial plan to go from a single cell to, let's say, until the top of the line right now, which is man. There was no plan to go that way with all the animals and plants in between, but this is just what happened. There is a continuation of evolution, and that something beyond man will evolve, or there will be animals that will appear and disappear in various forms throughout this whole evolution idea. So how did this happen? Well, two concepts are involved, adaptation and mutation. And first of all, adaptation is just the innate capability of plants and animals to adapt, to change slightly, to make the best of their environment. Over the lifespan of the Earth, there have been quite a number of ice ages where glaciers cover a good part of the Earth, and now quite a number of very hot situations where deserts covered the whole bulk of the earth. And so this cycling between very cold and very hot is something that some animals and plants are able to adapt to, while as others are not. So those who can adapt change their characteristics slightly in order to be able to continue living, and they pass those characteristics on to their successors. The plants that and animals that cannot adapt end up becoming extinct. So that's one way in which a species can change and form a slightly different species. The other one is mutation, and that's a genetic thing that we now know that the DNA of plants and animals is a thing that controls how they grow and what they develop into. And the chromosomes, the DNA, which is made up of chromosomes, and the chromosomes, which contain genes, can have mutations, can have changes that just spontaneously occur for a variety of different reasons. And when these mutations occur and say a gene is changed, that can give a different characteristic to the animal and to the successive animals that are born with that genetic change also in their bodies. So the whole idea here is that adaptation and mutation can give you a new species. So that is evolution theory in a nutshell. That is the idea, that is the concept of evolution theory, and it is in the nature of a theoretical science, which means it's something that's heading toward a science if it can obtain proof. With that theory, and with all theories that end up starting out as a possible science, the theory must make predictions, and then those predictions must be checked to see that they're valid, and go through a number of cycles like that you will see in the scientific method video later on, until ultimately everything that theory predicts is proven, and therefore it becomes a science. And ultimately, if it's very, very important and very, very well supported, it becomes not only a science but a scientific law. So scientific adaptations and mutations that are considered in evolution theory lead to these three main predictions that are listed below here. First of all, evolution theory predicts that missing link fossils should exist. Now, a fossil is the encased remains of a prior living being, plant or animal, within rock. And so an animal died, it was in such conditions that it ultimately ended up encased in rock, and later on, in recent times, that rock was unearthed for some reason or another, and that remains were found in a fossil. So this has been found, quite a number, millions of fossils have been found over the decades and the centuries. And the idea here from evolution theory is that there should be some missing link fossils. The term missing link means that there should be some fossils that are intermediate between one living species and another species. For example, if you believe that a fish ultimately somehow mutated into an amphibian, that there should be some intermediate steps, some fish with amphibian-like characteristics, and some amphibian with just a few fish-like characteristics. So there should be a whole sequence of these fossils showing how one changed into another, because it didn't happen instantly. It happened slowly with many small steps over time. So missing link fossils should exist. And in fact, Charles Darwin in his book believed that they should be many, many, many of these because of these many slow steps and what he believed in terms of how one species changed into another species. And he thought it was just a very short time before a whole bunch of these missing link fossils would be found. He believed that the geological understanding at the time was not well enough developed so that geologists knew where to look, but once they figured that out, they would be finding a whole bunch of missing link fossils. But what has happened over the last over 150 years is that absolutely no missing link fossils have been found. There are no missing link fossils in between any plant and any animal sequence of species. In particular, no missing link fossils have been found in between man and what other creature might be hypothesized to be the precursor to man. So no missing link fossils have been found, and that is a failure of evolution theory to this point. Now, they also have expected that no complex organ should exist. Darwin was very concerned about this possibility, and he devoted several chapters to talking about complex organs and to giving reasons why they should not be found in order to invalidate his theory. And in particular, he said that if complex organs are found, my theory is unproven, is untrue. He said that right in his book. He also did say that for missing links. If missing link fossils are not found, my theory is not true. And so far, those two fears of Darwin have come true because complex organs have been found. Now, a complex organ is an organ or part of a living being that is so complicated that it defies reason to think that it could have slowly developed. The idea with slowly developing different characteristics for plants and animals is that if they develop a different characteristic and ultimately leads to an advantage where they exist over some other living beings that did not develop that advantage, that general idea is that new advantage must develop rather quickly. If it develops slowly, it won't provide an advantage and it will quite likely die out. It will just not continue to be developed because it will provide that animal with no advantage until that organ is completely evolved or made. So Darwin thought that no complex organ should exist, and you'll see in later tapes that they have been found. The living cell is the best example of a complex organ. You'll see if you look at the cells video, it is so complicated and so complex that it could not possibly have slowly developed over time. Now, a third prediction that would need to be made or would need to be found to be consistent with evolution theory is that there should be some Precambrian animal fossils found. Now, that may mean nothing to you unless you're a geologist, but basically a geologic period called the Cambrian period, about 500 million years ago, is known to have resulted in a very, very many new plants and animals appearing in fossilized form. It is known as the Cambrian explosion because of all these life forms that over the geologic time of just a million or 2 years, which is a very short period of time from evolution timing, all of these plants and animals just appeared in various distinct forms. And if that is so, it is a complication, a problem for evolution theory because these plants and animals should have developed slowly over time. In particular, for the animal side, there should be some earlier animals in the fossils that showed how these animals slowly developed and then ultimately resulted in the Cambrian formed animals. And so there's been an ongoing search for Precambrian animal fossils in geologic ages that significantly predate the Cambrian period. And to date, none of those been found. All of the Precambrian fossils that have been found have been plants, not animals. So at this point, there are three predictions that evolution theory has made. All three have failed. And if you look at the scientific method video that follows this, there will be an opportunity here to significantly modify evolution theory to account for these failed predictions. If not, the theory needs to be basically stopped and not to try to become a science. So there has been no positive proof found, no missing link fossils, but yet negative proof has been found, and that leads to very extreme difficulties for evolution theory. Now let's just take a look finally at the other side of here for creation history. It is, biblical creation history is history, not science, so it doesn't have predictions that it's made, but if you read history, you can see what is not said there, and that can give you what I term here implications from that biblical creation history. First of all, the implication is that no missing link fossil should exist because it says in the history of biblical creation that God created this and then he created that and he created that. It does not say that creation was separated by some intermediate fossils that were done. So at least it's consistent with no missing link fossils. It has an explanation, which is of course faith-based, but it has an explanation that God made those complex organs. He decided to put an eye in a human being or other animals so that they could see and avoid predators. This third one is you'll not be able to understand at this point, but it basically also shows that there are no animals expected to be found before Cambrian times. Now, that is probably quite unbelievable to you by just me making that statement, but what we're going to see in later videos is that these 6 days of creation actually have a timing associated with them. The discovery and Nobel discovery of something called the cosmic background radiation has resulted in a clock for the universe that has been ticking since the beginning of the universe. And when we apply that clock to these 6 days of creation, we will have Earth years associated with each one of these days, the expanse of each one of these days, and we will see that there should have been no animals on days 3 and 4, which are the Precambrian times. There should have only been animals starting on day 5, and we'll see that again in later tapes. So the question that I ask in the remainder of the work or the videos that we're looking at here is Genesis creation at least consistent with known history and science? And we're going to show you that both of those are true, that the known history that we have is consistent with what Genesis says, and you're going to see quite a number of scientific areas that give support for historical biblical creation. So that pretty well concludes this slide, what I wanted to say, and I'll give you a few seconds here if you want to stop it in some form to look at it in a little bit more detail and think about it. This slide kind of summarizes what was contained on the prior slide in a little more understandable way, perhaps. The red check marks are those that indicate which side won in a particular area of competition for explaining life on Earth. And let's look at the first one here. We see that evolution has predicted that life forms will get more and more complicated versus time. And Darwin made that prediction in 1859 in his book. And I consider that a win. That was right. It was basically a postulate for evolution theory, but it is consistent with what we know today as a result of finding a whole bunch of fossils over time, showing that the simpler fossils are the oldest and the more complicated fossils are the more recent fossils. But also, biblical creation has the same answer. It talks about having created plants first, and then some of the primitive sea life, followed by fish and birds, and then land-based animals. So it also predicted or stated that more complex life forms occurred later in time. And this prediction was made at least around, if not before, 200 BC, so it was made about 2,000 years before Darwin's prediction or Darwin's conclusion that this was the case. So it's a tie in a sense, but since biblical creation was 2,000 years ahead of Darwin, I would say that they probably would win this battle. Another interesting fact that you may or may not know is that Darwin ultimately did get a college divinity degree, so he had studied the Bible in his college studies and had a father and other relatives who were Christian ministers, so he was aware of this as well, at least subliminally, and when he started to develop his evolution theory. So that is the place where basically there is kind of a tie maybe or something reasonably close between the two theories for life. Now we will see later that the specific fossil data sequence that has been found with geologic ages assigned to them is going to agree very closely with the timing of biblical creation. Again, where this cosmic background radiation clock is involved in putting a time to the various creative events in biblical creation. We'll see that the fossil data agree very well with what biblical creation says historically did happen. And of course, there was no specific plan for life sequence, so that's not something that you're going to even check in evolution theory, whether the right animal appeared at the right time. But it is, in fact, a win for biblical creation. I've explained to you in simplified form that this business about Precambrian animals and whether or not they should exist, and we'll see in a later videotape that they should not exist as biblical creation, and we of course know that at this particular time evolution Paleontologists have not found any Precambrian animals in order to support the slow development of the Cambrian animals that exploded on the scene at Cambrian times. So again, a win for biblical creation. The missing link side, in which biblical creation is not consistent with having all kinds of missing links, that's a win there, though evolution is still looking for those missing links. And finally, the complex organ side, at least on the biblical creation side, has an explanation for the ones that have been found, that they were created by God, that they were faith-based. That's a faith-based conclusion, but we have an explanation for how they got there, and there's no explanation in evolution theory. So ultimately, this kind of summarizes the idea that evolution is not true, and that biblical creation is the correct explanation for life on Earth as we know it. This is the final slide in this videotape, and it just summarizes the conclusions that you've seen inklings of and explicit statements of in other parts of this initial video. You'll see more support for these conclusions in later videos. But what I've concluded is that the best explanation for life on Earth is historical biblical creation. It is not evolution theory that best explains, and in fact, evolution theory does not explain any aspects of life in terms of being a scientific discipline. That biblical creation, rather ironically, which is history, has strong scientific support. It doesn't have scientific proof because it's not a science. Biblical creation is history, and that history, as we'll see, we look at a number of different areas of science that support the historical accounts that are reported in biblical creation. In addition to that, there are other parts of the book of Genesis that contain some historical accounts that may seem at this time to you to be a little bit unbelievable, such as 1,000-year lifetimes, Noah's flood, and things like that. I will show you in later videotapes that these things also have strong scientific backing, which means they quite likely did happen as well. So the net result of all this will be that biblical creation, as well as the historical accounts that proceed in the remaining parts of the biblical book of Genesis, have strong scientific backing indicating that they are true. On the other side, we have evolution, which, as you've seen, is still a scientific theory. It has no proof. If you look at the scientific method video, you will see that scientific theories start out and they are correlations until they gain proof. So evolution is really still a scientific theory that is a correlation, not a science, not a proven science. You've seen that there's no positive proof for evolution. No missing link fossils have been found after 150 years, and you've seen at least one indication that a complex organ has been found, and I'll show you several. But the living cell is a complex organ that negates evolution theory. And the most ironic thing to me is that evolution theory is literally faith-based. It is something that you can believe or disbelieve, but if you believe it, you need to be cognizant of the fact that you are believing it by faith. There is no proof to cause you to believe it. So that pretty well concludes this initial introductory videotape, and I would hope that you would go on and see the remaining tapes, and at some point or another communicate with me either through the guest book or through an email at dalen@whyevolutionisnottrue.com. Communicate to me what you think of these videos, whether you believe or disbelieve some or all parts of it. And if you really want to get into a discussion, you can do it through email, in which I'd be more than willing to correspond with you and try to answer questions you might have, and or talk with you about what data you seem to believe shows that what I have here is not true. Either way, thank you for looking at these tapes.